I'd spent my entire adult life on commercial fishing vessels, so when I finally saved enough to buy my boat, it felt like graduation day. The Calypso wasn't much. A 30-foot trawler with peeling blue paint and a temperamental engine. But she was mine. My wife Sarah bought me a brass compass as a christening gift. "So you'll always find your way back to me," she'd said, kissing me goodbye before my first solo trip. The forecast promised clear skies with moderate winds, perfect for a 3-day excursion to test my new fishing spots about 40 miles offshore. I'd plotted my course meticulously, packed enough supplies for 5 days just in case, and even splurged on a new emergency radio. Everything was going according to plan until the second night. I'd anchored in a promising area where my depth finder showed a significant underwater structure, the kind that attracts larger fish. After a satisfying dinner of beans and canned ham, I turned in early, planning to start fishing before dawn. The gentle rocking of the boat usually lulled me to sleep, but something felt different that night. The motion seemed irregular, as if the current beneath me was shifting in unnatural patterns. Around 2 a.m., a hollow metallic bang jolted me awake. It sounded like something substantial had struck the hull. My first thought was a shipping container. Those things occasionally break loose during storms and float just below the surface. Invisible death traps for smaller vessels. But when I grabbed my flashlight and went topside, what I saw made far less sense. About 50 yards from my starboard side floated what appeared to be the remains of another fishing boat, slightly larger than mine. In the moonlight, I could make out its weathered white hull and a partially collapsed cabin. No lights, no signs of life. Just a ghost ship drifting silently across the black water. I called out, "Hello, anyone aboard?" My voice sounded small against the vastness of the ocean. No response came, but the wreck seemed to drift closer, even though the current should have been pushing it in the opposite direction. I decided to start my engine and put some distance between us. Ghost stories about phantom ships suddenly seemed less ridiculous out here in the darkness. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The starter clicked uselessly, and the battery indicator showed a full charge. It made no sense. By the time I looked up again, the derelict vessel had somehow closed half the distance between us without making a sound. Close enough now that I could see dark stains trailing down its hull, a shattered wheelhouse window, and a frayed rope trailing in the water. I grabbed the radio and called for assistance, giving my coordinates and describing the situation. Static was my only answer. I tried again on the emergency channel. More static, punctuated by what sounded like distant whispers. The wreck was now close enough that I could have thrown a line and hit it. Despite my rising panic, I felt an inexplicable urge to see inside the other boat. Something about its silent approach seemed almost purposeful, as if it had been looking for me specifically. I trained my flashlight on the vessel's stern, where a name should have been painted. The lettering was weathered but still legible. Calypso. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. I turned to look at my stern, suddenly uncertain. The name painted there matched my registration papers. Wave Runner. But I'd always called my boat the Calypso. The name was only in my head and in conversations with Sarah. I'd been planning to have it properly painted next month. As I stood frozen in confusion, a pale face appeared in the shattered wheelhouse of the other vessel. The features were bloated and blue-tinged, but unmistakable. It was my face staring back at me. The ghost ship was now close enough that I could see other details. Fishing gear identical to mine scattered across its deck, the same distinctive scratch on the port side that I'd made during docking last week. And there, hanging from a hook in the cabin, Sarah's brass compass. Something scraped against my hull. Looking down, I saw pale hands gripping the edge of my boat, dozens of them, pulling themselves up from the water. Their skin had the bloodless pallor and puckered texture of something long submerged. I ran to the cabin for my filleting knife, the only weapon I had aboard. When I returned to the deck seconds later, my boat was surrounded. The wreck of the Calypso had vanished, but in its place were floating bodies, their faces turned upward towards me. I recognized some of them, old fishing buddies who'd been lost at sea over the years, a rival captain who disappeared in a storm last spring, and others I didn't know but somehow felt I should. One by one, they began to speak, their voices gurgling through water-filled lungs. They all said the same thing. "Join us, Nathan. It's your time." I slashed wildly at the first set of hands that reached the railing, but the knife passed through them as if cutting fog. Cold, wet fingers closed around my ankles, and I felt myself being inexorably pulled toward the edge. The last thing I remember before the cold water closed over my head was looking up at my boat, my empty boat, drifting away without me, and seeing, just for an instant, a figure standing at the wheel, a figure with my face, staring down at the spot where I'd disappeared. When the Coast Guard found the Wave Runner 3 days later, it was completely deserted. The engine was in perfect working order. The emergency radio functioned flawlessly. The only unusual thing they found was a brass compass in the cabin, badly corroded, as if it had spent years underwater, its needle spinning endlessly in circles. Sarah never believed I was gone. She told anyone who would listen that I'd return someday. 5 years later, when another fisherman reported seeing the Wave Runner drifting empty 40 miles offshore in the same spot where it had first been found, she insisted on accompanying the search party. They never found the boat. They never found Sarah either. But sometimes, on particular nights, fishermen in those waters report seeing 2 vessels sailing in tandem, a blue trawler and a white one, each following the other in an endless circle. They say, if you look closely enough, you can see the faces of the pilots, a man and a woman, each staring ahead with empty eye sockets, navigating by something other than sight. The salvage operation was supposed to be straightforward. Locate the wreck, retrieve the steel safe from the captain's quarters, and return to shore. The insurance company was paying triple my usual rate for the job, which should have been my first warning sign. The second should have been their refusal to tell me what was in the safe or why they needed it so urgently after the cargo ship had been on the ocean floor for 3 months. But money talks, and I'd been struggling since my divorce. My ex-wife got the house and half my diving business. I got the boat and the bills. So when Armstrong Insurance offered me enough to clear my debts for a simple retrieval job, I didn't ask too many questions. The Virgil went down in a freak storm, the adjuster told me, sliding coordinates across the table. Roughly 300 feet down. Nothing too challenging for someone with your experience. I'd been diving wrecks for 15 years, but something about this job felt off from the beginning. When I checked marine records, there was no storm reported in that area on the date the ship supposedly sank. When I asked the insurance company about this discrepancy, they added another $10,000 to my fee and suggested I focus on the retrieval rather than the circumstances. I should have walked away. Instead, I charted a course, The site was approximately 18 hours from port, far enough away that I'd need to spend at least one night at sea. I brought along Miguel, my most experienced diver, and Ellie, our newest hire, who was already showing remarkable aptitude with underwater navigation. We located the wreck easily enough. Its massive hull appeared on our sonar exactly where the coordinates indicated. But from the beginning, the readings were strange. The depth finder showed the ship at 300 feet, as expected, but occasionally jumped to over 1,000 feet before stabilizing again. Electronic glitches aren't uncommon at sea, but all our equipment exhibiting the same error simultaneously was unusual. "Looks like she's in one piece," Miguel observed as we studied the sonar image. "Clean descent to the bottom." "Too clean," Ellie murmured. "No sign of hull breach or explosion. Ships don't just sink without reason." I had the same uneasy feeling, but we'd come too far to turn back. We prepared our gear for the morning dive, specialized equipment for the depth we'd be working at, redundant air supplies, underwater comms, and lights powerful enough to cut through the perpetual darkness of the deep ocean. That night, none of us slept well. The sea was unusually calm. Not a ripple disturbed the surface, which created an eerie sensation of floating in a void space rather than on water. Every few hours, our depth finder would emit a series of rapid beeps, as if suddenly detecting a change in the seafloor. Each time, I checked the readings to find the wreck had seemingly shifted position by several meters before returning to its original location. By dawn, we were all on edge but determined to complete the job. Miguel and I would make the descent, while Ellie monitored communications from the boat. Our plan was simple: locate the captain's quarters, cut through to the safe if necessary, attach the lift bags, and ascend with the target. The first 100 feet of our descent passed uneventfully. The water was clearer than I'd expected, with visibility extending perhaps 30 feet in any direction, unusual at this depth. At 150 feet, the massive dark shape of the Virgil began to materialize below us. And that's when I noticed the first truly disturbing detail. The ship was oriented wrong. Cargo vessels typically settle on the seabed either upright or on their sides. The Virgil was balanced impossibly on its stern, its bow pointing upward, as if frozen in the final moments of sinking. Physics doesn't work that way. No ship maintains that position after hitting bottom. "You seeing this?" Miguel's voice crackled through our communication system. "Yeah," I responded. "Let's proceed carefully." As we approached the vessel, I noticed the second impossibility. No marine growth covered the hull. After 3 months underwater, the ship should have been showing early signs of colonization by barnacles, algae, and other sea life. Instead, the metal was pristine, almost gleaming where our lights touched it. We entered through a cargo door on what would normally be the port side, but was now effectively the top of the ship, given its vertical orientation. The interior was disorienting. Corridors that should have been horizontal ran vertically like elevator shafts. We propelled ourselves downward through the ship's inverted architecture, navigating by the emergency floor plans I'd studied before the dive. The captain's quarters should have been 3 levels up from the main cargo hold. As we descended through the impossible geometry of the vertical ship, our lights began to flicker. Temperature gauges showed a sudden drop from 46 degrees Fahrenheit to near freezing. "Control, we're experiencing equipment issues," I reported to Ellie. "How do you read?" Her response came back fragmented. Unusual sonar, moving, deeper than, Get out. Before I could ask for clarification, our primary lights failed. In the dim glow of our backup lights, I saw Miguel pointing towards something ahead. We had reached the captain's quarters. The door was open, and inside, the safe was visible, not hidden or locked away, but sitting prominently on what had been the wall, but was now effectively the floor. Too easy. Much too easy. Miguel gestured toward the safe, but I held up my hand in a wait signal. Something dark moved in the shadows behind the safe. Something that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "We're not alone down here," I said into my comm unit. No response came from either Miguel or the surface. I switched to hand signals, indicating to Miguel that we should retreat. He nodded and began to turn when a horrible grinding noise filled the water around us, metal twisting against metal. The entire ship shuddered, and then it began to descend further. The sensation was unmistakable. We were sinking, despite already being on the sea floor. Our depth gauges confirmed it, spinning rapidly as we plummeted past 500 feet, 600 feet, deeper than the charts indicated was even possible in this area. Miguel frantically pointed upward, and we began to swim for the exit. The corridors seemed to elongate as we moved, distances impossible to judge in the failing light. When we finally reached the cargo door we'd entered through, we found it sealed shut. No sign it had ever been open. "There's another way," I signaled to Miguel. We turned toward the emergency exit route I'd memorized, only to find ourselves in a corridor I didn't recognize. Our situation deteriorated rapidly after that. Disoriented and separated, I lost Miguel somewhere in the twisted passages of the sinking vessel. My air supply indicator showed 30 minutes remaining when I finally found an exit point, a shattered window in what had once been the bridge. As I squeezed through the opening, I caught a final glimpse inside the ship. The shadows behind the safe had coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape, tall and impossibly thin. It turned toward me, and though it had no discernible face, I felt it seeing me. I broke the surface nearly a mile from where our boat should have been. By some miracle, Ellie spotted me and pulled me aboard, immediately getting us underway at full speed. "Where's Miguel?" she asked once I'd caught my breath. I could only shake my head. We filed a missing diver report and searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. There was also no sign of the wreck on our sonar, just a bottomless trench where the sea floor should have been. 3 days later, the insurance company denied any knowledge of sending us to that location. All their paperwork indicated they'd contracted us for a routine inspection in shallow waters 10 miles offshore. The adjuster I'd spoken with allegedly left the company months earlier. I've refused all salvage jobs since then. My boat sits unused at the dock, gathering dust and rust. Because sometimes, late at night, my depth finder activates on its own, beeping urgently as if it's detected something below us, even in dry dock, and the numbers it shows are always the same, getting deeper, impossibly deeper, as if something far below is pulling at us, waiting for us to return. The storm hit without warning, transforming what should have been a pleasant weekend sailing trip into a desperate fight for survival. My 28-foot sloop, Windchaser, was a sturdy vessel, but no match for 30-foot waves and hurricane-force winds. I'd been sailing solo, as I often did when needing to clear my head after particularly difficult shifts at the hospital. As an emergency room doctor, I'd seen more than my share of death, but nothing prepared me for facing my own. When the radar and radio died simultaneously, I knew I was in serious trouble. My last position check put me roughly 70 miles offshore, far enough that swimming to safety was impossible. All I could do was batten down and pray the storm would pass before my boat was torn apart. It was during the worst of the tempest, as I clung to the wheel fighting to keep the bow pointed into the waves, that I first felt it, the distinct sensation that I was no longer alone on the boat, a prickle on the back of my neck, like being watched. I dismissed it as adrenaline and fear playing tricks on my mind. The storm eventually subsided around dawn, leaving me adrift in dense fog under an eerily calm grey sky. The wind chaser had survived, but not without significant damage. The mast was cracked, the mainsail shredded, and the engine wouldn't start. Worst of all, the storm had carried me far off course, to where I couldn't be certain. Taking stock of my supplies, I had enough food and water for perhaps 5 days if I rationed carefully. No functioning instruments meant I'd have to navigate by the stars, assuming the fog cleared enough to see them. I set about making what repairs I could, working methodically to distract myself from the gravity of my situation. It was while attempting to fix the radio that I heard it for the first time. A faint, wet, slithering sound coming from below deck. I froze, listening intently. Nothing but the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Convincing myself it was just the normal settling of a boat after a storm, I returned to my futile repair efforts. That night, the fog remained impenetrable. I couldn't see the stars, couldn't determine my position, couldn't form a coherent plan beyond conserving energy and hoping for rescue. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by that persistent feeling of presence, of someone or something else aboard. Each time I woke, the air seemed thicker, damper, carrying the faint scent of decay. On the second day, I discovered wet footprints on the deck, not my own. They emerged from the water over the port side, crossed to the cabin, and disappeared. Their shape was roughly human, but too elongated, the spacing between steps too far for a normal stride. The fog remained and now seemed to cling to the boat, as if reluctant to release it. By the third day, I'd begun to hear whispers beneath the consistent white noise of water against the hull. Unintelligible at first, but growing clearer, desperate, pleading voices speaking words just beyond my comprehension. I found myself responding aloud, asking questions to the empty air, then catching myself with a nervous laugh. Isolation psychosis, I diagnosed clinically. Auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. The medical explanation should have comforted me. It didn't. On the fourth day, I saw her. I'd been dozing in the cockpit when movement in the water alongside the boat caught my attention. A pale face stared up at me from beneath the surface. A woman, her features distorted by the water, but unmistakably watching me with dark, unblinking eyes. When I jerked upright in shock, she didn't flee or sink away, but continued to pace the boat just below the waterline, keeping perfect time with its drift. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding strange in the muffling fog. "Are you real? Do you need help?" The face tilted slightly, as if considering my questions. Then pale hands pressed against the invisible barrier of the water's surface, not breaking through but flattening as if against glass. The woman's mouth opened, impossibly wide, water rushing in, yet somehow she still stared, still moved alongside my boat with terrible purpose. I scrambled away from the edge, heart pounding. When I found the courage to look again, the water was empty. But that night, the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of wet footsteps pacing the deck outside my cabin. On the 5th day, I woke to find seawater pooled on the cabin floor, despite no obvious leaks. In the small puddle lay a single pearl earring of antique design. When I picked it up, it was ice cold and seemed to pulse faintly against my palm, like a tiny heart. The rational part of my mind, the physician who relied on evidence and empirical observation, catalogued my symptoms clinically: dehydration, despite my careful rationing of water, elevated heart rate, probable hallucinations. The rest of me knew with mounting certainty that something had found me adrift and alone, something that had no intention of letting me reach shore again. That night, I wedged myself into the furthest corner of the cabin, the flare gun loaded and ready in my sweating hand. Outside, the footsteps circled endlessly. Inside, the standing water on the floor slowly rose, inch by imperceptible inch, despite my constant bailing. Just before midnight, by the dim glow of my failing flashlight, I saw the water on the cabin floor begin to move against the gentle rocking of the boat. It gathered itself, forming a sinuous tendril that rose like a serpent, swaying slightly in the stale air. Frozen with terror, I watched as it grew taller, thicker, gradually assuming a human silhouette. The figure that finally stood before me had the shape of a woman, but was composed entirely of seawater that somehow held its form. Through her translucent body, I could see the cabin wall behind her, distorted as if viewed through rippling glass. She wore the phantom impression of an old-fashioned dress, her hair floating around her head as if still underwater. Where her eyes should have been were dark, empty sockets, and at her ear, a single pearl earring, identical to the one clutched in my rigid fingers. "Who are you?" I whispered. The watery mouth moved. "You let me drown," came the reply, the voice gurgling and distant as if speaking from the ocean floor. "That's not possible," I said, my doctor's mind still fighting for rational explanations. "I've never let anyone drown. I save people. It's what I do." The figure drifted closer, water dripping from her form to rejoin the rising pool at her feet. "Not yet," she said, "but you will." She told me then, in her terrible liquid voice, about a ship that would capsize tomorrow, not far from my current position. A family of 4, mother, father, daughter, son. She described how I would find them clinging to debris, how I would only have the strength to save 3, how I would choose to leave her, the mother, behind. "I won't," I promised desperately. "If I find you, I'll save all of you." The waterwoman's face rippled in what might have been a smile. "That's not how it happens," she said. "You'll try to save my daughter first, as you should. Then my son. By the time you return for my husband and me, he'll be desperate, hysterical. He'll fight you, dragging you both underwater. You'll have to make a choice." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why not just let me drift past, never encountering your family at all?" "Because time doesn't work that way in the deep," she answered, her form beginning to lose cohesion, water dripping more rapidly back to the rising pool. "What will happen has already happened. I've been watching you from beneath since the moment you left me to drown." By morning, the cabin was dry again. The pearl earring was gone from my hand, leaving only a small circular burn on my palm. I convinced myself it had been a vivid nightmare brought on by fear and deprivation, until the fog finally broke around noon, revealing a clear blue sky and, In the distance, the unmistakable shape of a large yacht listing severely to one side. I could hear the screams even before I'd maneuvered my crippled sloop alongside the sinking vessel. 4 people in the water, just as she'd described. A teenage girl struggling to keep her younger brother's head above water, a middle-aged man trying to swim toward them, and slightly apart, a woman with dark hair and a single pearl earring, looking directly at me with an expression of calm recognition. As I threw the life ring toward the children first, exactly as the water woman had predicted I would, I caught the mother's eye one final time. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then deliberately removed her life jacket and slipped beneath the surface before I could cry out to stop her. The rescue unfolded exactly as foretold, save for one detail. The father didn't fight me, didn't drag me underwater, because his wife had already gone, sacrificing herself rather than making me choose. I managed to pull all 3 surviving family members aboard my damaged boat. We were spotted by a Coast Guard aircraft the following day and rescued. I never told anyone about the water woman or her warning. The family's grief over losing the mother was compounded by the mystery of her actions. Why would she remove her life jacket when help was so close at hand? Only I know she didn't drown that day. She had drowned long before, in some impossible fold of time where the future and past bleed into each other like water. I've given up sailing since then. But sometimes when it rains, I find small puddles of salt water in my home, no matter how far I move inland. And in each one, if I look closely enough, I can see a pale face watching me from below the surface, still following, still waiting for a debt that can never be repaid.